What if I told you Haki is actually originally from Dragon Ball? Most of us are pretty much Dragon Ball fans. And I always found it very interesting that Oda's always been saying how Dragon Ball is his favorite manga and his biggest inspiration. And while I do see some occasional similarities, nothing felt that similar beyond the surface level stuff. Like Luffy and Goku being eerily similar in regards to their appetite, their somewhat aloof nature, and honestly genuinely how much they mean to their series. You can even mention different voice actors being on both shows, but that's more about things around the show, not exactly the show. For instance, Luffy's voice actor voices Krillin in the Japanese dub, and Chris Sabat, who is the voice of Vegeta, voices Zoro in the One Piece dub, English dub. So they know it. A lot of people debate whether Haki existed from the start, or did Oda come up with it later? And the answer is actually, well, both. Cold turkey may be great on sandwiches, but there's a better way to break your bad habits. We're not talking about some weird mind voodoo from your crazy neighbor or learning to float in your kitchen via meditation. We're talking about our sponsor, Fume, and they look at the problem in a different way. Now, not everything in a bad habit is wrong. So instead of a drastic, uncomfortable change, why not just remove the bad from your habit? Fume is an innovative, award-nominated device that does just that. Instead of electronics, Fume is completely natural. Instead of vapor, Fume uses flavored air. And instead of harmful chemicals, Fume uses all natural, delicious flavors. You get it. Instead of bad, Fume is good. It's a habit you're free to enjoy and makes replacing your bad habit easy. Your Fume comes with an adjustable airflow dial and is designed with movable parts and magnets for fidgeting. It's a lot more flavorful than you think, and it has a fresh undertone, specifically the white cranberry flavor. And the maple pepper is perfect to set the mood at night with just the right flavor and aftertaste. The actual device, it's a perfect weight. Like once you have it, you just can't stop fidgeting with it. And just looking at it, the wood is amazing. The shape of it is pretty much perfect, and you feel pretty cool using it. Go to tryfume.com/BDA law or scan the QR code to save an additional 10% off your order today. One Piece needed something different. One Piece needed Haki. Well, I guess that depends on your point of view, your perspective, and how you view pre-time skip. Now, Haki as a concept existed from the start, but not as a combat mechanic or a power system. If you look at early One Piece, you can see some remnants of this original concept of Haki, but Haki was originally primarily supposed to be imposing your energy on the enemy, a way for strong and important characters to have a presence on the characters around them, and it's a direct successor to Ki or power level from Dragon Ball, even downright to the name. Look at how Ki is written, and that means spirit, while Haki has the added Ha, meaning dominance, so spirit dominance. The name itself is a direct reference to its original concept, since it's specifically about exerting your spirit on opponents, whereas, for example, Observation Haki has nothing about exerting your spirit on an opponent. The name Haki was just used long before Oda fully developed the 3 subtypes and was somewhat forced to stick with it. Think of the many scenes in Dragon Ball when a character suddenly walks in the room and has such a strong presence that it makes anyone who is able to perceive it shake in fear, which Toriyama loved doing with every new villain or power-up. We see this similar Haki early on in One Piece, commonly with Shanks, who at the time was the pinnacle of strong presence, like in chapter 1 with the Sea King, or of course Shanks walking on Whitebeard's ship. Oda occasionally went too close to emulate key power levels, like in Enies Lobby when he used Fukuro to measure the Doriki or power level of CP9 members. But while Oda, as a shonen author, desperately wants to distinguish presence or power levels between characters, one of the things he hates the most is limiting himself to the point of not being able to move beyond these rigid systems. That's one of the reasons why bounties exist, to hype up a character but still maintain that ambiguity because of the many other surrounding factors of having a high bounty. Haki is also another method he was considering to use for an immediate power level measure, like Ki, like when he essentially used Blackbeard as a scouter when he meets Luffy and Jaya and Impo Down, commenting on his Haki level increase. Now, despite the fact that we know Luffy had no observation or armament at the time, and he's never used Conquerors before this either. And unless Blackbeard is some unique Haki sensor in the world, then you shouldn't be able to tell Luffy had Conquerors, since even the most top tier characters like Admirals, Whitebeard, Garp, and so on were not able to tell, which then begs the question, which Haki was Blackbeard even talking about here? But you see, this was based on the original Haki, which was intended as something innate and present in all people, but in varying degrees, like Ki in Dragon Ball. The decision to incorporate observation and armament and turn Haki into a full power system likely came from the growing problematic nature of Logias and similar powers that make them immune to damage, including Luffy himself. Oda once said in an interview that Luffy worries him the most since he defeats main villains right away. And he stated, unless he makes Luffy get stranded or delayed by some obstacle, it makes things difficult in regards to fighting. So he said, when you create a protagonist in manga, it is not a good idea to make him too strong. And that's where the Akainu becoming the protagonist and finding the One Piece in 1 year, that's where it came from. But think about it, if Oda had issues with Luffy probably being too strong from the jump, imagine with Oda trying to balance Luffy's powers and his creativity in regards to taking down these enemies. Most people prefer pre-time skip in regards to One Piece and just how exciting the story was. So let's dig a bit deeper. And Luffy defeating specific enemies and the ways he had to figure it out and overcome them. A lot of it was creativity. Some of it was power-ups, but for some of his enemies, he did not know how to hit them and had to figure out a way around it. From Crocodile to Enel to Magellan. And then even for an enemy like Smoker, he never figured it out. And so, Oda had to be creative, which some would love this method, considering it wasn't just about whose Haki was stronger, or Ryo, or advanced armament, or advanced coding. It's about Luffy finding a creative way to get around these elements and these different uber creative devil fruits. But think about that as an author, to find a way to defeat an enemy without undermining said enemy and Luffy just being flat out better. Because it's not about Haki, it's about Luffy being creative and being a better fighter at 19 years old. So a lot of these grizzled vets in the new world being stomped out by essentially a kid, it reflects negatively on them. Which, to this day, one could argue Crocodile does not get the credit he deserves. Better for story, a lot more stressful on the author. And then, how do we combat Logias? So it depends on your preference. Do you prefer pre-time skip, where Oda had to be a bit more creative with Luffy defeating enemies, which I think a lot of people prefer, as opposed to post-time skip, where Luffy has Haki, and if his Haki is stronger, generally he gets the W because he's a battle genius. Not as creative, not as interesting, but definitely a lot more epic. Now that's not to say Luffy hasn't been creative post-time skip, but the level of which Luffy had to dig into his creativity bag pre-time skip, it is not even close. For instance, Luffy versus Crocodile, one of the more underrated fights pre-time skip. The choreography and creativity in that fight matches up with any fight in One Piece. Seriously. And at this point, Luffy had lost twice to Crocodile. He had been overrun by Crocodile sand, and also his moisture had been absorbed. So now Luffy goes in for a punch. Crocodile puts his hand out. Luffy instinctively uses his foot to stop his punch, and then used that momentum to get out of the way and came back with the roundhouse kick. Crocodile dodges and goes in for an attack with the hook. Luffy grabs onto a ledge to dodge out of the way and then lands like nothing ever happened. This is creativity and choreography at its best. And guys, it only gets better pre-time skip. Luffy is an absolute monster. This needs to be said, but I can understand in the anime sometimes how it can feel over the top. One Piece being as subdued as it is, specifically in the manga, makes for some amazing exchanges that really doesn't have to be exaggerated to be appreciated. And this simple exchange with Luffy versus Crocodile is an example of that. But all that is to say, well, it's not just about Haki. If Luffy had Haki at the time, or Ryo, he could just simply block it and just send it away. With this, without Haki, Luffy had to be uber creative, and I think that was the beauty of it. Without armament Haki, Luffy's fights meant that his enemy almost always had to come up with some cutting or sharp weapon involved, like Buggy, Krieg, Arlong, Crocodile with his hook, and Nell with his spear, Lucci with his Zoan claws, and so on. Moria was completely unable to hurt Luffy except when he had his bats bite him. So this somewhat limited Oda's approach to fights and meant that we couldn't have epic shonen straight fist-to-fist brawls like Luffy versus Katakuri if he continued like this. But it also limited his creativity, like I stated, because now he doesn't have to find a unique way for Luffy to win. If his Haki is stronger, he can dodge enough attacks, he can get enough hits in, he can win. And also now he can't just create Logias. He has to come up with their natural weakness and make it available to the characters fighting them to have a chance. It was one too many restrictions on character creation, which meant a change had to be made. A proof of this late inclusion of armament Haki is also clear during Ace versus Blackbeard, a fight between two Logias. Logias up to that point were known to be invincible without their natural weakness or seawater. But at the time, revolutionary Black Vortex Kurozu actually allowed Blackbeard to touch Logias. One of the most powerful properties in one of the most powerful devil fruits in the world made its user able to touch and physically attack Logias, something that nowadays basic armament Haki can do. Ace was mortified that he was able to be hit, calling it a troublesome ability, and Blackbeard remarking that as a Logia, it must have been a while since Ace was last hit, which in hindsight is funny since any Haki user can hit Ace, but it would make sense if Oda at that point had not yet decided to create armament as a widespread form of countering low he is. And so far, everything seems to be consistent with that notion. Since Kurozu is an old remnant based on the initial concept of Haki, we can likely expect Oda to majorly buff that ability in the future to make it more of a threat in our current Haki system. Because of the wide range of fighting abilities due to Oda's creativity, when first creating armament and observation as categories, he naturally realized that several abilities he's already created neatly fit into those categories, hence retroactively including them into those categories like Mantra and Skypiea and Zoro's Haki versus Mr. One. We even saw this in real time in Wano when Oda conceptualized Ryo. He was working through the kinks. He even somewhat retconned it to say Rayleigh used Ryo to take Kami's handcuffs off. That's not the technique I remember, but this is Oda working through the kinks. But going back to Ryo and Oda conceptualizing it, it became very similar to Lucci's 6 King pistol, even having the same visual effect. So he had the Vivicar team change Lucci's card to say that he strengthened his already learned Haki instead of first learning it during the time skip like it originally said. So, while this isn't the type of video to say that One Piece copied this or One Piece did this better, this idea came from wanting to dissect One Piece not from a reader's perspective and what Oda wants to show us, but by peeking behind the curtain and looking at it from a creator's perspective and how this story came about and developed into the thing it is today. When we take a step back, One Piece is a beautiful puzzle that's come together in different ways, but Oda creatively has added new puzzle pieces, per se. Now, did One Piece need Haki? It depends on perspective. One thing's for sure though, Haki is definitely inspired by Ki from Dragon Ball, and also the power system continues to evolve. Maybe that will be the next thing we talk about.